Imagine my delight to discover that my old seminary classmate, Daniel, is the rector here. So thank you, Daniel, and thank you all for being so welcoming. I was the rector of the Episcopal Church in San Carlos, and in June, I was finally able to take members of that congregation on a long-planned but COVID-delayed pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And it was wonderful. So one morning, as we were traveling from the Galilee up in the north down towards Jerusalem, we chose the inland route, traveling right through the middle of the country and into the territory known as the West Bank. Now, the West Bank is controlled by the Palestinian Authority, and as you cross into the border, there are huge red signs, really bold, you can't miss them. And they say in Arabic, Hebrew, and English, this road leads to Area A under the Palestinian Authority. The entrance for Jewish citizens is forbidden and is dangerous to your lives. Not very welcoming, is it? But it's just one indication of how complicated and divided that land is. Life is not always safe for Israeli Jews, and life is certainly not always safe or easy for the Palestinians. And it has too often been thus in that tiny piece of God's creation. In Jesus' day, they didn't need big red signs that say you are not welcome here, it can be dangerous for your lives. Every Jew knew that your life was in danger if you took that inland route. It wasn't called the West Bank then, it was called Samaria. And to be fair, Samaritans put their own lives at risk if they moved out of their home turf. So why this enmity, this hatred among people who are actually very closely related? We need to sort of back up about 500 years before Jesus' time. We've been hearing a lot about the Babylonian Exile these past Sundays, haven't we? We heard from Jeremiah this morning. There was the well-titled book of Lamentations the last couple of weeks. Those Jews who were forced into exile understandably just longed for return to their homeland, dreaming of how one day things would be restored and wonderfully just like it used to be. It was never going to be like the good old days. When the Jews did return from exile about 70 years later, they discovered that foreigners had been moved into Samaria. Some of those foreigners had married with the local Jews who were left behind. They had their own gods and practices. They built their own temple, and there things just got worse. And the mistrust and the hatred between those two groups continued all the way down to Jesus' day, 500 years later. And lest we be a little smug about that, think of how long the bloody enmity lasted between Catholics and Protestants in England, in Northern Ireland, and how deeply divided we are as Christians today in this country. So, back to Jesus' time. If you were an observant Jew, you wanted to travel from Galilee down to Jerusalem, there was a pretty safe alternative route, but it meant crossing the Jordan River and going all the way down a route on the eastern side, sort of what we would call the country of Jordan now. Made for a much longer journey, but no smart Jew would ever take that shorter path through Samaria, except for Jesus, who did it all the time. So why did he do that? To make the point that God's love and mercy and compassion are for everyone, even for those who are considered to be the enemy. Remember the story of the Samaritan woman at the well? One of my favorites. The parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus made the Samaritan the good guy in that story. It would have been shocking for his audience. So here is Jesus again today. Looks like once again he's going to head straight into enemy territory. And I imagine his disciples were not thrilled to be dragged along. But they got to witness something spectacular. And so do we. The gospel writer Luke tells us, as Jesus entered a village, 10 lepers approached him. Keeping their distance, they called out, saying, "Master, Jesus, have mercy on us." A really brief word about leprosy. Today, the very few people who contact Hansen's disease can be cured simply with antibiotics. Back in Jesus' day, there may indeed have been some people with actual leprosy, but the term applied to anyone with a skin disorder. So you might have eczema or psoriasis or shingles, you would still be considered to be a leper. And woe to you if you were. Besides suffering from whatever skin disorder you might have, you were considered an outcast. You were ritually impure. The book of Leviticus mandated by law that anyone with such a defiling disease must wear torn clothes, let their hair be unkempt. They had to cover the lower part of their face and cry out, "Unclean, I'm unclean." They must live alone, it says. They must live outside the camp. Those ailments were considered to be terribly contagious, and so those poor souls were banished, and not just from their faith community, not from their lives, their livelihood, but from their own families. Just imagine, we've been through a little bit, just imagine the amazing loneliness of living in legally, religiously mandated quarantine for the rest of your life, forever. Now, could they re-enter society? If a really big if you were somehow cured of your skin ailment, you could go to a priest of the temple, they would examine you, and after a ritual purification, the priest could certify that you had been made clean. You could be readmitted to society. So imagine how desperately those people would want to be healed. Is it any wonder that when they saw Jesus, they call out, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." And he does. Jesus demonstrates God's compassion and mercy by simply saying, "Go and show yourselves to the priest." And as they went, we are told, they were made clean. Just a few words from Jesus, their lives are completely transformed. At last, they can be reunited with their loved ones. They've gone from being outsiders of society back into society. Just imagine their gratitude. And gratitude, even more than the extraordinarily healing in this story, is really the point of today's gospel, isn't it? Only one of those who was healed turns back, goes back to say, "Thank you." He recognizes the power and the extraordinary love of God is present in Jesus, with a mercy that extends beyond all boundaries, even to a non-Jew. It's the Samaritan, the enemy, is the one who demonstrates gratitude. He throws himself at Jesus' feet, offering his thanks and praising God with a loud voice. So Jesus, I imagine, looking around, the other 9, where are they? Were not 10 made clean? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner? I can imagine he's a little irritated, maybe a little ticked. So Jesus says to the man, "Get up and go on your way. Your faith has made you well." Your faith has made you well, really well. In fact, a better translation is your faith has made you whole. This man recognized God's amazing gift. His first response was not to run off, but to say, "Thank you, God." And Jesus knows that faith and gratitude are linked together for healing and for true wholeness. And we know it too, don't we? I know it is not always easy to feel grateful. Life can be very, very hard. This community has lost way too many members of late. You had another memorial service just yesterday. There has been cause for lamenting. But in the midst of sorrow, in the midst of all kinds of challenges and sadness and grieving, there can be gratitude. Gratitude for the many years of friendship we have shared with loved ones who have died. Gratitude knowing they have returned to the embrace of a loving God. Gratitude for not being alone in our grief. I pray that you have felt the solace of community these last days. I hope that when your friends ask you how you got through really, really hard times, at least part of you, what comes to mind is your faith, and how that faith is nurtured and tenderly healed and held in this community. Like those lepers who called out to Jesus, do we want our lamentations to be heard and transformed? Of course we do. Do we want to feel uplifted and restored and whole? Always. And here's another gift. There is even something healing about the practice of gratitude. Research has proved that the practice of gratitude improves both our physical health and our mental health. The practice of gratitude helps us deal with adversity. It helps us build more and stronger relationships. It reduces stress. It builds up our self-esteem. Practicing gratitude is consistently associated with greater happiness. It even helps us sleep better. What's not to like? All of this from the simple act of saying, thank you, God. In today's gospel, Jesus is not asking very much of us. He's simply asking us to stop, to pay attention for the many, many gifts that we enjoy, and to say thank you. The Greek word that our gospel writer uses for the Samaritan's act of thanksgiving is Eucharisto. Sound a little familiar? It's the same term we use every day here in church. The term Eucharist means thanksgiving. So as we gather at God's holy table today, I invite you to listen carefully to your own response when Father Daniel begins, "Let us give thanks to the Lord our God." What is our response? Always, it is right to give God thanks and praise.